Thanks, Afrouz. Afrouz was in my urban design tour class this last short while, so nice to see you. And almost going from teacher to student. Anastasia, of course, is my PhD supervisor, someone I'm learning so much from. How does this work here? Oh, okay, we have a blank screen is what we have. Did I not do it right?
We have a little bit of a technical problem. So I invite you all to speak amongst yourselves for a few minutes, and I apologize.
I need the static screen. Thanks, Patrick. Oh, it's bright. Full credit to all speakers. It's really bright up here. Lighting. It does. Thank you so much. PDF has been the cause of some of my greatest problems in life. Yeah. So I can't see anybody, but I don't like to stand behind the podium. Quickly, how many people here are from Vancouver? I know I recognize a lot of you. Some of you, most pretty predominantly Vancouver class. I also, I as a sessional instructor at SCARP in transportation, our class is now, and I see a few of the students here right now. And they're not in class, even though we have an excellent guest speaker, so don't think I didn't notice. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the questions I've been asking as part of almost more of a practitioner role here in the city, but it's related to some of the issues I'm interested in from an academic side. And some of the questions that I'm asking about our city here in Vancouver, not only what has made it successful, but what we need to do to renew that success for a new generation, the types of questions we need to be asking and engaging to advance our city to meet the needs of a new generation and take on some of our challenges. The title, I don't know, it's a little dorky, I admit, but what I was trying to get at is that I'm interested in urban design as a continuous process, an ongoing day-to-day decision-making process, those little things that add up to our built environment. And I propose that that's a really interesting place of intervention. It's a little bit, now it's a little bureaucratic, but that's quite frankly how cities work. There's so many complex actors that we deal with it through these processes. And I wanted to push back a little on the more static conceptions of urban design as a product, which is not. I mean, everyone's talking about it as a dynamic, engaging process. But I think we typically do cross sections, we slice through it, and I want to talk about it as an ongoing process. And a lot of this has come as, as mentioned, I'm on the Vancouver Urban Design Panel, very fortunate to be so. I represent the Vancouver Planning Commission on the panel. I'm very fortunate to do so. We see Elizabeth here, wonderful adept manager of the Planning Commission. And it's been an interesting process because, one, the design panel is a really integral part of decision-making on design in Vancouver. but it's also gotten me to think about it a little differently. And so talking to a lot of practitioners of the city, a lot of planners, designers, developers, I'm starting to ask the question, and it seems simple, but how do we get good urban design? Not the questions about, well, we get it by taking care of walkability, of care for relationship between people, all super important. But no, how do we actually get it? If we even know what we want, how do we get it? And so this is a bit of a talk about how we do this in Vancouver. It's more about the how than it is about the what. So the sort of the tools approach from Tisdale and Adams. And cities get good urban design, obviously, in a lot of different ways. One, as active participants themselves, patrons of public space and public buildings. They employ designers. They engage the public directly in conversations about design. They have competitions to get good urban design. But quite frankly, in a city like Vancouver, that's a very small slice. Vancouver is predominantly made up by private sector development. Even the relatively generous public spaces that you'll see on our waterfront was part of private sector redevelopment and the negotiation with those. So cities can act as catalysts, as making investment decisions. Our Canada Line, for example, has created a tremendous opportunity for a new type of corridor urbanism through the city. We can be conveners, celebrators. In fact, a lot of say we get better design by simply showing how high the bar can be by celebrating our most adept practitioners. We provide, I keep thinking of myself as a city planner still, information, study, test, share. But of course, as much as anything, we're regulators of private actions. The rules and processes and the standards and the criteria that we set. Oh, I'll go back. So how does Vancouver regulate and advance urban design? And in some ways, the city is a best practice practitioner, but it still has a lot of space to go. And it tells us a little something about how this process can evolve in a collaborative and iterative way. So a little bit of background. I think of this as part of a series, a body of work that to me starts really with Jonathan Barnett, and urban design as public policy. Again, that day-to-day decision-making that occurs in the city. Matthew Carmona has done a lot of work on this and talks about design as a continuum, but I've always been enchanted, as simple as it is, and he even says himself, this is a caricature, but that tension between the development markets, money, capital, between the political, usually represented by planners in this type of negotiation, and the creative, the tyranny of the creative and the planner. And how those push and pull is really central to how good urban design, or bad urban design, happens. And of course, Punter's work on Vancouver itself, it's done all the groundwork for us in many ways, and it documented a really fruitful era in the city, but also on design control and governance and best practice. So I won't go into that, but here's just a cross-section of the type of best practice principles we see. And Punter has identified Vancouver as a city that exemplifies these, actually incorporates many of these principles. We could debate that. So how does Vancouver work? That's what I wanted to do. How do we work? One, the city is discretionary. In the North American setting, it is probably the most discretionary system we have. It's discretionary administratively. A surprising amount of decisions can be made through the director of planning, and in a much wider set of decisions, including some substantial variation on use, density, and height, where the money is, can be made through the development permit board or the development permit process. So that occurs without council. It is discretionary. It provides flexibility, so a tremendous amount of leeway so the city can vary, which is really valuable. I use the example here in the image of the really wonderful Roar 1 project by Oliver Lang, which as far as I know, still has the city's record for most variances in a single project. So it's not quite a discretionary project, but it's an example of the type, and it's actually much more innovative than the facade gives it credit for, of a city collaboratively engaging with a private sector to come up with a much better solution than we typically see in our C2, our major commercial corridors. But it also provides the discretion, provides the incentive. By the discretion, and so that happens administratively, but also happens through rezoning processes. Vancouver doesn't have the type of plan that many of us would consider to be a citywide plan. What every municipality in British Columbia is required to have, the official community plan, Vancouver, because of its charter, doesn't have. So while it certainly has a plan, it has a lot of planning documents, a tremendous amount of planning. It doesn't have the kind of map that you would typically associate that would have densities and heights in a plan level. So you can, just by rezoning and going to the CD1, Here's our zoning map. This is the closest thing we have to a land use map in the city of Vancouver. You just change the zoning. So that's a much usually easier process, particularly if you're in California, you would have to do a general plan amendment and environmental assessments and years. We're able to change our land uses relatively quickly. So the city's able to adapt surprisingly quickly. If you see purple in there, that's a CD1, that's a custom zone, that's a rezone. Some people might call that a spot zone. And a lot of that got tested and refined on a big scale at the Concord Pacific Place. The city is also remarkable. How did it get good design? Well, it actually cared about design. It put design as a central point of its public policy decision-making process, obviously much bigger, and showed us how much more the city cared about the design. Design is really a small portion. But design is remarkable in that, one, the city has put a lot of effort into it and put a lot of policy, particularly since the 1970s, and Ray Spaxton very Vitruvian principle of commodity, firmness, and delight, and a lot of work on design. But also that design is actually the trigger for a lot of development entitlement. That the city will say, well, yes, you can go higher, or you can go bigger, you can go denser, provided you perform well on the design attributes, as well as some other ones. But design has an outsized role, I would argue. And there's a lot of policy work. You can see through the design guidelines, the just tremendous amount of study and research that's been done on the design relationships and how those evolved over time. And they're valuable because they were done in a collaborative way with, like most cities do, with consultancies, but that back and forth is a real part of the Vancouver story. And there's just another example. So it's part of the collaboration. And a real investment by the city in design capacity, not only in its review staff, but most notably as well in the design studio that could bring design talents and skills out to communities and engage them in a collaborative process and raise some of the level of the conversation specific to design. And not only that, with the discretion, that incentive would shift the idea of the decision environment towards design. It empowered a lot of designers because it was worth going through even a more arduous design process because there was an incentive on the other side. So you're rewarded in increased value. Good design governance. This is a picture of the design panel in action. This is an older one. Ralph Siegel did such good work in that group. I apologize for the maleness of it. It's actually a problem we still have. We have a predominantly male design panel, and actually there was a motion at council coming up. There's a notice last week of aiming for gender equity, so it's still work to be done. So yeah, I used to apologize for that, but it's still the problem. It's gotten better, and then it got worse, whatever. But also, so the good design, you can have this kind of discretion and flexibility if you have rigor to your process, and that's the key. So when you talk to people from other cities, you go, oh, we want to learn from Vancouver. I go, well, hire architects. And what Vancouver used to call UDPIC, urban design and I can't remember, planning policy, whatever. Now it's the urban design group. Vancouver's always had a practice in the last, since the 70s, of hiring registered architects who've worked in private sector work. That enables a conversation to occur between applicants, which are predominantly architects, even though developers may be behind it. And that sets the stage for a really interesting collaboration and back and forth conversation. And then that goes through development. There's a tremendous amount of rigor. I don't want to get too much in the banalities of it. And then rezoning, when that occurs, is an even larger process, a lot more public pressure. But what's really interesting, and I got to find better language, that talks about design performance. So on the design panel, this happens all the time. A project will come forward and say, well, we want extra density, we want extra height, we want extra whatever. And we say, well, what do we base this on? Well, design performance. We use this term a lot in Vancouver. I'm not quite sure where it started. Maybe a few of you might know. And it falls in the guidelines. And this is just one example of the criteria for increased height in the downtown area. You could just say it's long. There are multiple criteria, and it is always shifting and always evolving. So there is no one, I would argue, idea of what design performance is. It is detailed, but it's open, it's flexible, it internalizes multiple criteria, and it evolves. And that, as much as anything, is part of the story of how Vancouver achieves what it can and can renew it and do it. I'll get back to that. So yeah, I won't talk about this, the case study. The point and podium, needless to say, this point and podium is not, it's a response to a lot of design guidelines. If you want to have a point and podium tower, Vancouver's got the guidelines for you. But what's more interesting is how that has actually evolved over time. It's an example of how this goes, a back and forth, an iterative, collaborative process creates a solution that has its charms and its flaws, but it came out of this place. It responded to the site and its context in a really interesting way. It innovated with the townhouse wrap. I don't want to tell the whole story of it, but it goes through False Creek. You can actually see its evolution in the city through generations of buildings. One of the early ones, of course, Cambridge Garden is where my daughter goes to daycare, so I always like to show that picture. But I'll just skip over this. I want to get to the good stuff. And it continues to evolve. Actually, this is interesting. So the one on the left is a new tower that's been proposed. It went through the design panel a couple months ago. Ken Gakuma Tower, West Bank developer. West Bank's also developer of the Vancouver House, the Bjarke Ingels building. Is this good design performance? I don't know the answer. Usually, because I'll always push back on architectural design as being a key element of design performance. So this is where I've gotten into, again, this question of, well, how do we get good urban design? Well, one, we care. So this, Vancouver is a city that has invested in it, and it continues to invest in it. It builds capacity in it. But it also has been open enough to allow what it really is at the heart of getting good urban design, which is the ability to recognize a good solution, the creative solution, and champion it through the process. That's actually really rare, and I think the lean urbanism did such a nice job of showing how many times regulation gets in the way of those simple processes. And certainly in Vancouver, regulation gets in the way, oftentimes. But it does have the ability to do two things which I find really interesting: the stretch and squint. Right? The project like Coos Corner is a really great one, Bruce Hayden architect. A project that broke all the rules. But because of the discretionary system and the capacity built and the investment in this, city is able to squint a little and go, you know what? Meets the rules. Meets the performance. It performs right. Small building, really interesting. No parking, that's part of the squinting. So that's valuable. And it is in this that I think where we're at in Vancouver is a conversation I want to have, and I think we need to have. What does design performance mean today? It's difficult. It's been 20 years since the last significant citywide conversation of the values that drive urban growth. What does design performance mean today? It has evolved. We've incorporated social sustainability, elevated building performance, health. Actually, we had a panel a few weeks ago that had whole health as the central focus of a master plan development. We could talk about that for a little while. But what does design performance mean? And this is actually interesting. If more, that to me, while I think all the other stuff is really interesting and valuable to talk about, this is as well is an opportunity for intervention into the bigger processes of city building and to widen what we consider, I know what staff considers, and what we volunteers on the design panel have to come to terms with in terms of what good urban design is. And that's part of, to me, the question of, well, how do we get good urban design? Well, we allow for it, we work really hard, we collaborate, we find creative solutions, and we find a way to make it happen. And that's been the story of Vancouver as much as anything. Thank you so much.